where we could actually have gone if history didn't develop the way it did. There is something about the Palestinian existence almost living in parallel with the rest of the world.
How many powers just in the past 100 years have been involved in determining the destiny of Palestinian people who never quite had a say themselves?
Hello and welcome to a podcast from Amos Rex, a contemporary art museum in Helsinki, Finland. My name is Kieran Long, I'm the director here at Amos Rex, and I'm very proud to present the second episode of a podcast conversation between Dr. Nat Muller, a curator and writer, and Larissa Sansour and Søren Lind, the artistic duo whose work is on display at Amos Rex until March the 2nd, 2025, in a spectacular and large-scale exhibition. This episode is entitled Historical Narratives and Memoricide and continues the conversation about the central themes in Larissa's work and in her artwork overall. We hope you enjoy.
You mentioned the Nakba earlier, Larissa. So this is 1948, the foundation of the State of Israel and the expulsion of more than 750,000 Palestinians from their home. And coming back to trauma, often the Nakba is seen as the foundational trauma within the Palestinian narrative. But in your work, I feel that you show that the Nakba is not the only disaster and that this started much earlier. This is ongoing, and sadly, it will probably continue in the future too. So this larger historical lens, which you show in Familiar Phantoms, but also as if no misfortune had occurred in the night, where you start earlier. You place it already starting from Ottoman times, 1916, Sykes-Picot agreements where the Middle East is carved up between French and British forces, 1917, the Balfour Declaration where the Jews are promised a national homeland, but there are no provisions made, at least politically, for the indigenous Palestinian population. And then you fast forward 1967, there's the occupation of the West Bank, Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, Gaza, First and Second Intifada in the 1980s and the early 2000s. It's as if this catastrophe is always continuing and ongoing. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of casting a wider historical lens, but also not bracketing it, that it's still something that is perpetuating?
I think what's happening in Palestine has happened to so many different countries, and it's the result of colonialism. And this is all coming back to haunt Europe and the West in general, with all their history, and why we're experiencing such a very tense time at the moment in the West as well. And this kind of tension between East and West has never left, and it's now, I feel like we're on the precipice of something new. I just hope that it's for the better than for the worse. But specifically with Palestine, I think it experienced intense conflict there because it's the Holy Land. So there's been fighting over that land since Crusader time. And then the Ottoman Empire took over the whole region. That's why it was easy to colonize it by European powers. And then they're the ones who divided the land between Jews and Palestinians, and there we are. But it is part of that whole idea of the white supremacy, of going to seek out and educate the poor or the less educated world and looting everything and destroying those places.
I guess one of the other reasons why we went back, and we're happy to have gone back like a century rather than to the usual point of 1948, is that, yes, it shows a historical development that never quite favored the Palestinians. In the current circumstances, I think it's important to understand that this is a cyclical and century-long conflict that's been going on. We see explanations of what's currently going on in the Middle East oscillate between reducing this to something that has happened for the past 10 months as an isolated incident, and therefore try to sort of avoid understanding it in a historical context, yet at the same time reaching back hundreds and thousands of years to justify an idea of ownership of the same land. So we're operating on very many timescales when it comes to understanding the situation in the Middle East, and often these are opportunistic timescales in the sense of what favors your narrative will go back as long as it needs to, and what favors your narrative as well will stay very short term in order to isolate your incident as a freak episode. Why we went back was to understand, well, how many powers just in the past 100 years have been involved in determining the destiny of a Palestinian people who never quite had a say themselves. So we did go back 100 years to, as you say, the end of the Ottoman Empire. Before that, of course, things were not hunky-dory either. But the onset of a British Mandate period followed by an Israeli occupation seems to sort of, that's taken over by now, the past 100 years. And it was important to go back and say the ruptures come now and again with a few decades apart, as you say. The Second Intifada, back to the First Intifada, 67, 48, and so forth. And one reason why we also went back to around 1916 is that this saw what by many are classified as the first Palestinian exodus, namely of Palestinian men who, at the time of being occupied by Ottoman forces, were attempted drafted to fight the Ottoman war against the Russians on the Eastern Front. They were, of course, not interested in being sent out to certain death for their occupier, and therefore a lot of them escaped often to South America to try to avoid that draft. And just the fact that there was an exodus before the exodus that we all know about, namely in the 1948, is an important historical perspective.
Mm-hmm. And also, these ruptures in the timeline that you mentioned, with each rupture is also coupled with an erasure. And in Palestine, there's so many erasures of place, of memory, of name, of language, of belonging, of heritage. Do you feel that in some sense your work counters those erasures, or does it also in a way amplify them in the sense that also these erasures need to be preserved in some way or other?
I think it does both, but I do hope that they counter those erasures in the sense that I do feel that I'm kind of pretending that the language did not experience any trauma, and somehow I'm taking the Arabic language into sci-fi language, which is something new. So it is kind of reconstructing something and making it breathe as though it's a living thing, whereas what really the whole Arab world have experienced is this complete stop of development in a commercial way is different than, a cultural development. And I feel that the cultural development of the Arab world has kind of reached an end. And I feel that working with visuals that pertain to a living culture and kind of insisting that this is a living culture is very important. And it does create a counter-narrative.
And I feel also all your protagonists, in a way, they're all strong women, and they all demand agency in a way, right? That's also something that, in a way, counters those erasures.
It is important to have the protagonists or the main characters be women in my films. And that's clearly because I always kind of want to be subversive in my films. I don't want to be kind of fall into this idea of what, say, a Western audience would want me to be. And maybe what's important in my work is to say that I know you see me through what lens, and I want to break that lens. So that's why there is an emphasis on the characters being women and speaking and having a language that's very different from the one that you expect, but also at the same time doesn't break away from the place that I come from. So it's not really foreign and orientalist in that way, but actually trying to kind of bring it to a place that's new, but from within its own character.
I was just going to say that a lot of your work is obviously rooted within the personal, but also the historical and geopolitical specificities of Palestine, but they also transcend that into narratives that are accessible and universal to everybody, in the sense that they deal with loss and lived experience, but also with aspiration and grief and family and love. How do you navigate those tensions between the Palestinian experience vis-à-vis the universal experience?
I don't think we necessarily try to navigate that at all. I think our language and our topics of interest have just organically developed over the past decade. And Palestine as a microcosm of tensions and conflicts and emotions and narrative struggles, as well as physical, real ones that go on elsewhere, makes it easier and easier for any other conflict or any other people undergoing the same kind of difficulties to mirror themselves in that. We're never trying to camouflage the fact that it is indeed Palestine that is our talking point, but the fact that we've taken a lot of historical liberties, but also in terms of abstraction from very concrete political documentary-style affairs, means that it is easier to take away with us the kind of concepts that we want to explore and unpack, and those seem to apply universally whenever we do try to unpack them. The reason why we sought a refuge in the future was that we felt that the contemporary dialogue had a tendency to lock, concepts into place and dismiss any kind of discussion that seemed to fall outside of those concepts, and therefore taking with us what we felt was underexplored in the present dialogue meant that we had to seek new grounds in the future. And doing that, we seem to have come across concepts that maybe others also found worthy of unpacking and exploring. And therefore, luckily, there's more to understand and gain from our work than just a new perspective on Palestine.
Mm. Palestinians dream of a nation and of self-determination. But in your work, the very notion of the nation-state as an organizing, political and identity-led category is under fire. We see this in A Space Exodus, where Palestinians planting a Palestinian flag on the moon. We see this in A Nation-State, where it becomes luxury high-rise. And in the future, the whole idea of the nation-state is abstracted and unknown. In vitro, it's completely destroyed, and in Familiar Phantoms, it just has failed. Can you talk about this critique of the nation-state and perhaps for that sake also this idea of the post-national in your work?
It's something that we have been talking about it, but in light of the global warming and imminent environmental disaster, I think we all have to start finding different ways by which we can actually live and survive on this planet. And it just feels that these concepts are archaic as they are, they're still necessary. And it's quite scary that they are still necessary when we are living in a global world where things are constantly changing. Yet we still treat all our problems with the same formula that we've used since those nations have started developing. So it is something that is so urgent, yet the focus is still on kind of dreaming about these great pasts instead of really trying to imagine futures of possibilities and of survival.
But to say that our work is entirely post-national is also not maybe entirely correct, in the sense that In Vitro maybe has that discussion. Are we or aren't we post-national? Whereas the younger person in that film is, because she's never had any stake in that past or that nation that almost came to be but never quite materialized. Whereas the older person is probably trying to resurrect what never was but was always the aim. And we're taking no sides in that debate. Just as we are continuing that in the feature film that we're currently working on, it is also about recreating a past version of utopia. And therefore it comes mighty close to saying we had all the ingredients for a nation state. Now we've got a clean slate, so let's do it. Because the way to emancipation, kind of what the film suggests, without, again, taking sides, has no other way than going through that nation-state stage. And Palestinians never having had that makes that a necessary movement, I think. And this is also what you see in contemporary dialogues about what to do with Palestine. Do we go one-state solution and therefore dissolve the idea of that nation-state, or will any kind of true emancipation have to go through the nation-state stage?
I guess speaking of post-nationalism is also a very privileged position. It feels that you have to have self-determination, you have to go through that stage in order to really start discussing your own dissipation of that state, which brings us to the question of one state or a two-state solution. And frankly, it's very hard to really understand how a one state is possible. And I think it's part of the fact that Palestinians have never reached that self-determination. They're going to be kind of swallowed in that setup or killed, as we see now. They're just being erased. Their culture has to come forward in order to then kind of negotiate a coexistence. So I think that is where a lot of this talk is kind of a privileged talk for people who have never experienced self-determination.
But maybe this is also exactly what we're saying, both in vitro and in the film we're currently working on, is that there's also nostalgia to the idea of the national, and therefore maybe it's also a generational thing, and it will evolve and dissipate and reconfigure itself in coming generations. You know, for somebody who's been fighting for self-determination, independence and statehood, but remains stuck at the level of stateless, there's no other way to say that I need to be the one to discard of that state, but I need it before I'll discard it. I cannot just bypass that stage. And it's not like the rest of the world is functioning. We may all be talking about the post-national, but God, politics around the world is not necessarily leaning that way presently, is it? So yeah, it's a generational thing as well, I think, and it's an interesting thing for Palestinians, and I think there is a stage in need of being cleared before we can have those dialogues.
You're predominantly known for your films and video work, but there's also often a sculptural element to your practice as well. And I feel it's very often underrepresented in a certain way. So I'm thinking of the Fabergé eggs of archaeology in absentia, the Black Spear of In Vitro Monument for Lost Time, but also many other works. So I wanted to ask you how these more sculptural works and installation works sit in your practice. How do you turn part of a video into a sculpture? And what is the importance of the embodied and material aspect of these particular works?
I think when we work, we usually imagine things through film, but we don't necessarily decide that this project is going to be a film, but somehow most of our projects start off as a film. And the films that we do have a lot of visual language and also a lot of discussion. It's sometimes quite interesting to see how these objects that appear in the film function when they're outside that film. In The Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain was those Fabergé eggs that are often shown next to the film are actually part of the film. So the film follows a rebel who calls herself a narrative terrorist because she's trying to change the course of history. And she uses these bombs to kind of bring down on various parts of historical Palestine. And these eggs hide porcelain plates that have the Palestinian keffiyeh pattern on them. So they kind of like represent Palestinian DNA, if you will. And so the idea was that she's so determined for her people not to be erased that even if that doesn't come in her present, she wants to leave an evidence for future archaeologists to excavate and find these remnants of these archaeological finds. So in a way, she's kind of planting facts for future archaeologists to find. But then we thought the way that this whole piece could make sense is to actually go and bury these porcelain plates in various parts of Israel and Palestine to kind of make a fictional object become real. And also, of course, that's a way of challenging the narrative of what is fictional and what is real, specifically when we talk about Israel and Palestine. So these objects, somehow, that were supposed to be kind of the imaginings of a crazy rebel in the film, are actually now exist in various parts of Palestine and Israel. And the coordinates of where these porcelain plates are kind of carved in these little Fabergé eggs that gets shown next to the films. Obviously, taking them out of the film makes this switch between how do you do the crossover from something fictional to reality much more poignant than just having the film. So in that sense, it is important to have that material presence. In vitro, you see a big black sphere, and that sphere kind of functioned as a repository of memory and the trauma of the main character. And then when we took it out of the film and made a real, actual sphere, whereas in the film it's a CGI existence, it became something completely different. It's quite interesting for me how the change of context redefines the objects. In a gallery setting, that big object becomes kind of a signifier of a place. We decided to call it a monument for lost time. So it becomes a monument rather than a place where the character kind of has a dialogue to kind of negotiate her traumas.
I think we think of ourselves more or less exclusively as filmmakers, but thinking that we almost sometimes tend to forget ourselves that we have this body of sculptural work. And I think it's because maybe it's the other way around, that we actually work a lot in sculpture. We just realize the sculpture is in CGI. We always go for a monumental presence in the films. And that monumental presence in the form of either the sphere or whatever element it is there somehow to embody and represent outside of the sort of semi-academic dialogue of the film, the emotional impact of what we're talking about. And I think that's the function of these sculptural elements. Let's not just stick to an academic dialogue or a rational dialogue for effect or explanation or unpacking of the concepts involved. Let's also arrange a swift punch to the gut, in a sense, and that's what the sculptures are intended to do. And therefore bringing them out once we've manufactured them in CGI is a lovely way of serving that in real life, and they do become intimidating once outside of their filmic context. I guess another reason why we don't really think ourselves as sculptors or photographers, for that matter, is that the sheer labor division between making filmic work and making all the other ones, the time it takes to make a film project is just excruciating. And plus, we are absolutely without any kind of sculptural skills ourselves. So we outsource the sculptural elements to others. And therefore, there's a distant relationship to these sculptural elements. We become the orchestrators of that, whereas our hands are very deep in the matter when it comes to the film production. So a film takes a year and a half, 2 years to produce. And all the while, as an abstraction, even for us, a sculptural element may take form. But because we're just directing it from afar off, and the immediacy and the sort of definition of ourselves as people who do that kind of thing is more abstract.
You see yourself first and foremost as filmmakers. The filmmaking practice has also changed over the years. You've gone from working with small crews and non-professional actors to working with professional art actors, larger budgets, more CGI. Can you talk about how working in a more expanded way has changed your practice, but also has turned you into film directors in that sense as well?
Yeah, I think when you work with a big team, you realize that anything's possible. It's just that the budget is what determines what happens, because you can always bring experts in their own fields and have a team like that. When we started off, they were lower budget films, and we kind of tried to have the elements agree with whatever aspects we could actually control. We even filmed ourselves. I was acting in front of the camera. So all these things, obviously, when they change, they offer new possibilities, that you can have the dialogue be, of course, much more intense and more elaborate if you have real actors in front of the camera. I have much more control of what's happening in the camera when I'm not in front of it. And the same thing with working with the VFX team makes you realize that the limit is really just the budget. And also you have much more feedback, because people want to see the project really be successful, and therefore there's much more feedback. And there's less of this artist in their own studio sitting and completing one's work. It becomes much more of a teamwork. And it's something that we both are starting to really appreciate, because what started as a feeling of a total loss of control has become something that we cannot really live with, the feedback of other people.
But maybe also add that in the beginning, what we did was handheld documentary style video artwork. The first major change was when we started using visual effects. That means that anything is possible. Any kind of crazy idea is realizable if budget allows. But what it also does is it requires of you to think much more carefully about absolutely every detail of your filmmaking, because once you start hiring very expensive visual effects teams, nothing should be left to chance. We can't just try this, try that. Every shot needs to be choreographed exactly so that we know that this effect that we've designed for upper left corner will both fit in and be realizable within the budget. The next big change was when we started working with dialogue and actors. Working with VFX is just an elaborate form of photoshopping, whereas working with live actors of a high quality as well, all of a sudden you start feeling like film directors, and the teams become bigger. So now, like, we're managing fairly big teams, and the feature film that we hope to shoot next year is going to be the biggest test so far.
I wanted to ask you about Familiar Phantoms, your last film, which I feel is perhaps your most personal, because you're in fact telling a fictionalized history of generations of Sansours. And it's filmed in your family home in Bethlehem with family members, your childhood souvenirs. And it really mines your childhood memories in a sense. So why, at this moment in time, such a personal film? And what are the phantoms that are haunting you, and why are they familiar?
We wanted to make a film about memory and memoricide, basically. And I think we got this idea when I was given a permit to go to Jerusalem about 2 years ago, and I haven't been to Jerusalem for 15 years, even though I was born in Jerusalem. And going to Jerusalem made me realize that I actually know Jerusalem much more than I know Bethlehem. Bethlehem is where I grew up, but Jerusalem is 15 minutes away by car, and we used to do all of our activities really in Jerusalem, and just basically Bethlehem kind of was like the suburbs of Jerusalem. And that realization that I actually know Jerusalem much better than Bethlehem, it really struck me emotionally. As to how much I actually subconsciously was trying to kind of tell my brain or convince it that Jerusalem never really happened. You know, Jerusalem was never really something that I have any relationship with. I know it, but it's almost like when you have a childhood memory, you feel like you own that place, it's yours. But when I was in Jerusalem, it was like, yes, this is my place. We kind of started this project with that as a launching pad of what does it mean to kind of be deprived of your geography? And what does that mean to the entire state of Palestine or Palestinians to be deprived of that geography? I mean, imagine how we don't think of Palestine, especially if you come from Bethlehem, as a maritime nation, and it's surrounded by seas. This idea just, I don't think even, say, the new generation who have ever seen the sea, who are born in Bethlehem. And I used to go to Gaza on weekends to just have seafood. So this idea of when you constantly have to kind of pinch yourself to really check if this is real or if this is part of your imagination is so Palestinian, and then so many Palestinians are going through this. And this is what we're witnessing right now as well. It's not Jerusalem now, it's Gaza. But it just felt that it's a film that is so important when it comes to the Palestinian memory and what that means for Palestinians and Palestinian identity. It was never really meant to be a film about me personally, but it felt the less or the more we tried to erase from my own kind of memory and make it more abstract, the less impactful it became. So even though for me it feels a bit uncomfortable that it's really so biographical, it feels that it kind of does hit a note to keep it so real in that sense. And because you need to have that in order to accentuate how fictional the state that we are in has become.
Yes. As much as hard present conditions would be something that your brain would try to resist at all cost, it also tries to justify them and explain them. And that's what happened in Larissa's case, of all of a sudden understanding, having retrofitted current political sort of restrictions to her childhood, which was entirely different. Namely, she could go to Jerusalem anytime she wanted. But now it's as if the brain had said, no, you were never really there. That idea of a rift between, not accepting on a rational note, but somehow having sort of crept underneath the level of your own operations and said somehow these conditions are now manifest in your past as well. And then going through the family stories to see that the same mechanisms are at play in other stories. We actually accumulated, by way of Larissa herself and her brother, interviewing her family members, found that a lot of these accounts of the past had the same kind of rifts. No, it was never quite like that. Even though everybody's telling the same story, it was the rift between versions of the same stories. And even going through Larissa's own stories of the past, understanding that she remembers this one particular episode so well, but really it was an experience had by somebody else, yet so rooted in her own understanding of herself as a child that it was a film about memory and the workings of memory in a Palestinian context. But once all these stories seemed necessary in order to give that take on memory and the workings of memory some weight and dimension and gravity, the stories themselves became impossible to eliminate because they themselves are also really, really telling of the Palestinian experience. However personal they are, every person in Palestine has a similar story.
So it's really these stories and these memories that are the ghost and perpetually keep on haunting, in a sense. I wanted to conclude with a final question that perhaps offers a silver lining, because I feel despite all the grief, trauma, and darkness in your work, there is very often a particular open-endedness and a speculative possibility for a horizon. So can you talk a little bit about this difficult, I presume, insistence that not all is lost and that there is still a sliver of hope?
I think that not focusing on bringing forth evidence of a wrong that has been done to the Palestinian people is optimistic in its own right. I mean, the focus on finding archives, showing that there has been a lot of violation of human rights is all important, but at the same time, it's not changing the narrative. And I think we need to change the narrative in a different way, because it's not the evidence and law that's really counts here. It's kind of winning that narrative. In a way, I think what's positive, or otherwise I wouldn't really be doing it, is that I do feel that I'm trying to change that narrative. And I think if I didn't have that belief that that is something that I am trying to change, and it is for the better, and it is a positive change, it would be very hard to keep on working on a subject that's so bleak and depressing, really. So I've been working on the Palestinian issue for 20 years. So this is my way of contributing to kind of brighter narrative, or kind of taking the narrative by the helm in that sense.
And these are fantastic words to live and close by. Søren and Larissa, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by Amos Rex in Helsinki. Thanks for listening. Larissa Sansour's exhibition at Amos Rex is on until March the 2nd, 2025. We hope to see you there.